Welcome to FlightGlobal Focus, your new essential podcast for trusted aviation insight. We publish new episodes twice weekly. Join us on Friday for a concise news briefing and on Monday for in-depth analysis covering airlines, defense, and aerospace. My name is Amber Elias, and joining me for this news focus episode is Lewis Harper, Airline Business Editor and FlightGlobal's Airlines Managing Editor. Lewis, welcome to this episode.
Hi Amber, good to be here.
Let's take a look at the top aviation stories this week on FlightGlobal. Lockheed Martin has secured a $12.5 billion contract to deliver nearly 300 F-35 fighters. The aircraft will go to the 3 US services as well as international customers. Deliveries will commence next year, according to Lockheed. Lufthansa Group expects efficiency gains from phasing out 6 wide-body types over the next 3 years. It aims to simplify the fleet to feature between 6 and 9 types by 2030. Gulfstream unveils a new G300 super mid-sized business jet to succeed the G280. The G300 will have a 6,667-kilometer range and will fit 10 passengers. Lewis, days ago, the Icelandic low-cost carrier Play suddenly ceased operations, citing weaker-than-expected performance in recent months that was exacerbated by negative media coverage of its operations. They probably won't like this episode either, but this seems to be a pretty sudden collapse of an airline which appointed a new CEO just over a year ago and published a new strategy at the end of last year to drop its transatlantic flights and focus instead on point-to-point services and wet leasing. What exactly went wrong for Play, and what were the red flags that indicated the collapse?
Well, brace yourself for a long answer there. Just to put it in a bit of context, so Play's first flight was back in 2021. It kicked off with point-to-point services connecting Europe, and then in 2022 moved on to kind of a hub-style network connecting North America and Europe via a stop in Iceland. It had around 10 Airbus narrow bodies at the time of its failure. So that's kind of where it was up until the last few days. In terms of what went wrong, I think we go back to a quote when we spoke to Play's then Chief Executive, Birgard Johnson, in late 2023, and he told us, you basically have to deliver a rock star performance every day just to stay alive in aviation. And wise words, I think, and I think there's plenty of evidence of the truth of that. And I think, when we look at Play, fundamentally, the odds are always against an airline startup. It obviously saw an opportunity to make a name for itself in Iceland by leveraging the niche of connecting Europe with North America via that stop in Keflavik. But generally, industry stakeholders tend to talk about the need for consolidation in the European low-cost sector rather than a need for additional operators. And as I said, broadly, startups do tend to fail. So it was a challenge as a starting point. In Iceland itself, it was always going head-to-head with an established operator in the shape of Iceland Air. Play's business plan didn't present many options but to compete on the same or similar routes and generally for the same passengers. But the idea was to do that at a lower cost. So that's not a crazy idea. The transatlantic market is lucrative and there's huge catchments on both sides of the Atlantic. Play wouldn't have to take much of that huge lucrative market to have a viable business model. So certainly as a starting point, there was the idea of a business there. And we'll talk a bit later about others who have attempted that as well. But I say when we look at Play's early days, so this is sort of in the tail end of the pandemic proper, as I put it, 2 things are notable. So the timing, because it was trying to launch during the industry's biggest ever crisis, and lessons it had learnt from predecessor WOW Air's failure in 2019. And of course, Play was conceived by 2 WOW executives just months after that airline had failed. So the feeling among those founding Play was that WOW had expanded too quickly, and crucially, it had strayed too far from its founding principles by operating wide-body jets, having premium cabins. Play would not make those mistakes, is what the executives said. Obviously, as I said, COVID-19 hit as Play was making plans for launch, and that brought challenges and opportunities. I think there's a big narrative shift involved here, but Play was launching operations in 2021, and at that point, I was covering the global industry then, and there really was a strong narrative that this was the moment for startups. Incumbents were on their knees, they were shedding aircraft that had become available for cheap from lessors, And, skilled and experienced employees were moving on to the job market. So, when Play launched, it looked like there was quite a lot in their favour. And it almost was one of the poster childs. When we were writing kind of features on what was going on and analysis of what was going on at that time, it would always be Play mentioned as a part of this new generation of airlines that might shake up the market within the context of what the impact COVID had on incumbents. And, reflecting that confidence, when Play launched, it launched an IPO on the same day as its first flight to London Stansted. But from that moment on, really, unfortunately for Play, quite a lot didn't go to plan. So quite quickly, that narrative around startups changed. So the abundance of cheap leased aircraft quickly gave way to a tight market for aircraft. And as we know, supply chains suffered in that post-pandemic period and continue to today. Incumbents in most markets, so including Iceland Air, also bounced back relatively quickly as travel demand returned. And a lot of those incumbents, including Iceland Air to some extent, were buoyed by state aid, which were delivered at the height of the travel restrictions relating to COVID. And obviously, as the economy heated up coming out of COVID, we saw inflation rise. We saw fuel prices rise, obviously a big proportion of airline expenses. Obviously, today it's a different story, but at that point, that was a definite trend. And obviously, airlines operating small fleets without economies of scale do face a cost challenge, particularly acute in that kind of environment. So broadly as well, Iceland Air, I was on lots of their calls and continue to be coming out of COVID. They would point out regularly that having two carriers attempting to grow in a market the size of Iceland's is ambitious. It's not the first time anyone's tried it, obviously, but even when you consider that niche kind of transatlantic opportunity, and Iceland Air's executives frequently referred to irrational competition in the country. They might not have named Play, but they would say that there's capacity being operated at fares that just aren't sustainable. And that was driving down their own fares and earnings across 2023, 2024 in particular. It's noteworthy. I did a look back in our archives, and previous Iceland Air executives used exactly the same word to describe competition from WOW back in the day. So a lot of irrational things going on, according to Iceland Air anyway. Obviously, when Play expanded beyond its point-to-point offerings into transatlantic connections via Keflavik in 2022, it didn't just have Iceland Air to contend with. So it's up against the big network carrier joint ventures and their full service offerings backed by established loyalty products on those routes. So it was only ever going to be a niche product. It required passengers to accept the idea they change aircraft in Iceland, and it needed to be compelling. And the most obvious way you're going to do that in that environment is through price for it to stand a chance. But of course, Iceland Air cannot be forgotten in that context. It was already experienced in doing that. And even though Play was trying to do it more cheaply, I don't think it ever really found its niche in that environment. Not unique to Iceland Air, but probably quite a bigger factor maybe than some markets is seasonality. So operating in Iceland, plenty of stuff going on in terms of demand in summer, a lot more challenging winters. A couple of other things unique to Iceland. Its fortunes weren't helped by seismic activity in the country. That attracted international news coverage and meant that Iceland lost out on inbound travellers at a key moment of the COVID bounce back. So complaining about the media is not unique to Play. Iceland Air, I've heard regularly complain about unfair media coverage of the danger posed by the seismic activity and the impact that was having on demand. But obviously, as I say, that hit Iceland Air and Play. Play's final CEO, Einar Orn Olafsson, told us back in 2024 that we've had our fair share of black swans. So yeah, they did face regardless of any structural challenges, a tough operating environment. And when you talk about red flags, I promise I'm nearly done. In this case, it would be the sense of desperation that came last year, I guess. So the last year or so of Play's existence was when it was abandoning kind of its founding business model. When you look at the low-cost market in Europe, why would you do something in Iceland? Well, it's because it's got that transatlantic option and the potentially big market there. If you're not going to do that, with Play dropping its transatlantic flights, instead focusing on point to point from Iceland. So essentially leisure routes, flying people on holiday. You lose kind of the thing that makes Iceland a really attractive, potentially attractive market for newcomers. And the reason it's doing that is obviously that part of the business wasn't performing as they'd hoped. But really, it'd shift the entire business model with 4 of its aircraft doing those point-to-point services, 6 moving into wet leasing. So, and they've also moved their AOC from Iceland to Malta. So it's kind of a pretty near wholesale abandonment of what was the driving force of setting up the business. So, yeah, as I say, 4 of those A320neo family jets for leisure operations and 6 going out for wet leases. And obviously, moving to Malta has financial and tax benefits and everything. But yeah, so when you talk about the red flags, it's kind of, if you see any kind of business say, right, we're struggling, we're going to have a wholesale change in what we do, that is an obvious one. And that really, as we look back now, was the beginning of the end for Play, unfortunately.
Yes, it does seem that although they ceased operations quite suddenly, it was actually a long time coming in, quite a slow decline from a potentially promising startup.
I think that's fair. When we spoke to the previous CEO back in 2023, I think they'd just had their first quarterly profit. They were reaching economies of scale in terms of their fleet size and things like that. So, but it didn't massively kick on from there. I think the ultimate CEO was an investor in the business who felt he needed to step in and obviously had a very personal interest in making it work. But yes, there wasn't a golden era for Play. I think that's fair to say.
And for such a small country, Iceland has fielded quite a few airlines in recent years, with not all of them successful. And WOW Air's failure in 2019 feels like a familiar story here as well. Did Play just make the same mistakes again? Yeah,
it's a really good question. I think just a bit more context on that. So Iceland has a long history of low-cost air travel, arguably stretching back to the 1950s even. Now I'm going to pronounce the name of this airline and never say it again. So it's Lockheed Martin, I think it's pronounced, was kind of a predecessor to Iceland Air. It was doing low-cost travel before that concept really existed, doing that kind of those transatlantic connections. And as I say, it eventually morphed into what we know as Iceland Air today in 1979. So that operation wasn't a member of IATA, didn't follow IATA's fare structure, that kind of thing. So it was very much a kind of early mover in that low-cost space. So there is a history, and that reflects that, as I mentioned before, that opportunity in Iceland to connect, certainly do the transatlantic connections that doesn't necessarily exist for other carriers in Europe. There was a virtual kind of small low-cost carrier that ran for around 10 years from 2002 called Iceland Express. When I say virtual, it didn't have its own aircraft, so it was wet leasing, a small operation again, but WOW purchased that when it was formed in 2012. And that was just a case really of purchasing the flying rights, etc. It wasn't a brand that continued once WOW had launched. So yeah, looking at why would you start an airline in Iceland and why do they go wrong? I suppose the Iceland Air's growth as a group, I mean, it's actually I think the biggest corporate entity in Iceland. Obviously, Iceland only has a population of around 360,000 people, so it's not going to sustain huge businesses. And obviously, there's a good reason why a business that can attract a lot of international revenue from international sources would be the biggest one there. But it kind of is grown into a group with kind of network carrier sensibilities. So I think it does aim for sort of a hybrid, more low-cost model, but it does have a premium offering. And I think there's a sense that leaves what could be seen as a compelling space in the market to do what Iceland Air is doing, but more low cost. And in that context, the question of whether Play repeated WOW's mistakes is a complicated one. I'd say in broad terms, yes. The executives of Play, so many of whom were from WOW Air, tried to start a low-cost airline in Europe. It's got that niche transatlantic role, but as a starting point, in very broad terms, that's a tough thing to do. And as I mentioned before, most likely to end in failure. But what Play tried to do and what it kept talking about throughout its existence really was to focus on not making WOW's mistakes. It didn't adopt wide-body aircraft. It didn't attempt to create hub flying to Asia from North America and Europe via Iceland. It didn't add premium cabins. It didn't plan to grow aggressively. It went public early on, meaning it had to be open about its finances, and that was all available publicly. But I guess the point here is, but not doing things wrong is not a guarantee of success, if you pardon the double negative there. So yeah, it's still, the odds were still against it. It had some bad luck, as I said before, the aforementioned COVID pandemic, the impact that had, the seismic activity. Clearly, all businesses and especially airlines know that there are going to be tough developments outside their control. But the pandemic was a particularly big one. We know that. And that narrative where it looked like the moment for play and then that didn't happen was quite cruel in the end. And as a bit more context, of course, WOW started up in 2012, which was kind of in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, so which obviously hit Iceland particularly hard. So there's a bit of a precedent there for obviously these big crises leading to people trying to enter that market. A footnote to this, I would say, is that when WOW was in trouble, Icelandair was twice involved in discussions to purchase it. This time around, there doesn't seem to have been anything like that. I think we obviously are in a different world today. Icelandair has hardly been on the growth path itself coming out of the pandemic. I don't get a sense it will be rushing to replace the capacity lost to play. It viewed a lot of that as irrational and will be more focused on driving profitability with what it's already got. Its fleet is a bit smaller, I think, at this moment than it was going into the pandemic. So at the moment, really, Iceland is a place where there are significantly fewer aircraft operating. But even in that context, I think we're heading into a period where Icelandair is going to operate without major competition from local carriers, at least. Play tried its best, talked a good game, knew what it shouldn't do, but in the end, the market was not there for the business model it was able to operate, I guess would be how I summarize it.
Absolutely. And are there any other airlines that we should be keeping an eye on for possible closure in the next 12 months?
Yeah, I might have to speak to our lawyers first before answering that too specifically, but I'm sure they are coming, as I would definitely say. This is the airline industry. After all, we do tend to run an analysis every year of what airlines have failed over the past 12 months. It's inevitable. I mean, and just this week we saw Swedish operator Bravens filed for bankruptcy for its Airbus base operation, which the company was in the process of phasing out. So it was winding down anyway. It will continue to concentrate on ATR services. But again, you know where to look for signs of weakness when you watch this industry. Certainly the theme that we saw with Play is smaller carriers trying to enter the market, going up against the big carriers. That's a good starting point. It's really tough at the moment to secure new aircraft at a price that isn't going to weigh too much on your bottom line as well. So yeah, broadly, it's always tough. I think it's worth noting that Lufthansa Group Chief Executive Carsten Spohr recently talked about a new level of resilience in Europe's airline sector. I think in his view, airlines learned a lot during COVID-19 and have arguably not been hit as hard by some of the pretty significant geopolitical and economic developments we've had over recent months and years compared with how they may have been hit during COVID. So certainly across the first half of the year, obviously lots of the trade wars and everything, lots of concern about demand, but airlines kind of made it through it pretty unscathed as it stands. So in his view, that does reflect more resilience, which I guess could feed through to fewer carriers failing, or it may just make the big incumbents stronger. But yeah, that's certainly will be an interesting theme we'll be watching as time goes on. I would say when you can't talk about airline failures really without talking about consolidation, you look at what is happening in the US at the moment with Spirit Airlines. Its consolidation with JetBlue was blocked. I remember writing at the time, analysts telling me when that kind of thing happens, obviously that doesn't guarantee, they're doing it to keep competition in the market. But part of the reason that consolidation was happening is because Spirit was struggling, and because it didn't happen, it's now continued to struggle to the point where it's in its second chapter 11. So we know consolidation is really closely linked. And when it doesn't happen, it can mean that airlines fail. And it is a live topic in Europe. Obviously, we've got TAP available for investment or purchase. In Portugal, we know Air Europa, Turkish Airlines are currently moving towards an investment into them to join IAG on 20%. SAS is moving into Air France KLM. ITA is moving into Lufthansa Group, and those are all in kind of the network carrier space. And I think at some point something will happen in the low cost space. That's not a particularly brave prediction, but it is. I think it may be sooner rather than later. We've seen it close before. We've seen Wizz make an audacious bid for EasyJet, I think, in the past few years. So that's theoretically a smaller carrier buying a bigger one. But I think when you look at what's happened in the US with consolidation, there's a bit more room for that in Europe. And I think whether airlines disappear through failure or consolidation, I think they will be themes to watch in the coming months and years.
It does seem like, the airline industry constantly in flux. We do have our sort of core brands, but the little ones on the edge, on the fringes, do seem a lot more at risk for either consolidation, being acquired, or folding overnight. But, that's the nature of the business. And at the end of the day, it does seem, as you were saying, the industry has been surprisingly resilient post-COVID. I think everyone thought that the tariffs would have a much bigger impact on that industry, certainly in terms of, passengers, people actually wanting to visit the US, but even in terms of freight and things like that, which obviously contributes a lot to these airlines' bottom line. But yeah, I think it's, something to keep an eye on over the next end of the year, well into next year, and, the next 5-10 years, we will see changes.
Absolutely, yeah. It's inevitable. It's not unique to the airline industry, but it is tough to get into. And there are reasons at the moment that it's particularly tough, as I mentioned, around securing fleet. A lot of the big airports are pretty capacity constrained in Europe, so getting into the right markets is tough, and the competition is strong. So Ryanair has powered out of COVID. Pretty tough going up against a business like that at any time, but something we'll be keeping a close watch on.
Absolutely. Lewis, thank you so much for joining me on this week's episode of FlightGlobal Focus.
Thanks, Amber.
FlightGlobal Focus is a production of FlightGlobal with audio editing by Lucy Johnson. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, or for commercial opportunities, please email podcast@flightglobal.com, and more information can be found in the show notes. Listen, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.